The prairie was still, save for the restless whisper of grass bending in the morning wind. Sunlight broke across the horizon in a blaze of copper and gold, stretching over plains that seemed endless, untamed, and dangerous. A lone rider emerged from that glare, coat torn from long travel, hat brim pulled low, his shadow riding with him in silence. Dust clung to his boots, his hands rough from war and years of wandering. He did not look back. Whatever lay behind him was nothing worth remembering. Ahead, a cluster of wooden structures huddled against the emptiness, as if afraid the land itself might swallow them whole. The town was young, built on hope, whiskey, and stubborn hands. The main street was a muddy scar carved between the saloon, a half-finished church with its steeple still skeletal, and a general store whose porch sagged as though already tired of its duty. Children's laughter carried faintly from behind a cabin, the sound strangely fragile against the vast silence. The rider entered slowly, eyes scanning every face. A blacksmith hammered at an anvil with the rhythm of survival. A woman drew water from a well, shoulders squared as though daring the world to test her resolve. A group of men leaned against the saloon rail, watching him with suspicion that fell heavier than any words. He tied his horse to a post and stepped into the saloon, where the stale air of whiskey and dust hit like a memory best left forgotten. Inside, the piano clinked a broken tune, keys missing like teeth in a drunkard's smile. The bartender looked up, saw a man carrying silence like a burden, and set down a glass without asking. He poured, amber spilling slow. The rider drank, not to quench thirst, but to quiet the noise that lived inside his head. Conversation in the corner shifted. A rancher spoke of wagons burned along the northern trail. Another whispered that the outlaw gang had moved closer, pressing harder on the settlers. Their leader, a man with a smile sharp as a knife, had been seen near the river, gathering men the way storms gather clouds. The words carried weight, but no one raised their voice. Fear here was not shouted. It was swallowed, passed quietly from lip to ear, a secret everybody already knew. The saloon doors creaked again. The sheriff entered, older than the land he guarded, his badge worn and his hands slower than they once were. He carried himself with the dignity of a man who had faced too much and endured because no one else would. He greeted the room, eyes sweeping over each man as if to remind them they were not alone, not yet abandoned. His gaze paused on the stranger at the bar. For a moment, silence stretched, thick as smoke. Then he nodded, as though recognizing something in the man's posture, an understanding between two souls who had seen violence close enough to never speak of it again. The rider left before his presence drew too much attention. He stepped back into the sun, scanning the horizon beyond the town. Out there lay more land, more emptiness, and, somewhere among it, work. He had no intention of staying where stories were traded like debts, where whispers of violence carried on every breath. On the edge of town, he passed a woman lifting supplies into a wagon. Her hands were cracked, her dress faded but sturdy, her movement precise and unyielding. A boy, no more than 8, trailed her, eyes curious but cautious. The rider tipped his hat in quiet respect. She did not smile, but her eyes met his with the same steel he had seen in men about to fight for their lives. She had no husband at her side, no helping hand but her own. He moved on, though her image stayed with him longer than he wished. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, the town gathered near the unfinished church. The sheriff stood on the steps, speaking of unity, of holding fast against the storm pressing down on them. His voice was rough, but conviction rang clear. He named the dangers, the outlaw gang, the railroads tearing to the land. The tribes pushed further and further until anger burned hotter than the prairie fires. The words filled the crowd, yet one could see in their eyes that faith alone would not stop a bullet, nor feed a child when winter came early. The stranger lingered at the edge of the gathering, unseen by most, listening with the wary patience of a wolf who has learned promises rarely hold. The boy from earlier tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking in a whisper if the town was safe. The woman placed a hand on his head. Steady? Sure, but her eyes betrayed her doubt. When night settled, the stranger found himself walking away from the lantern glow, away from the chatter and the false sense of safety. The plain stretched open, endless. He breathed deep, tasting dust and freedom. Yet the silence was not comforting. It pressed down like a weight. He set his course toward the woman's homestead, where rumor said she needed help with fences and stock. It was honest work, the kind he could take and leave without tying himself to anyone. Behind him, the saloon emptied, voices low, men glancing toward the dark horizon. Somewhere beyond the reach of the town's lanterns, fires burned. Outlaws drank, laughed, sharpened knives for the next raid. Their leader sat apart, watching the flames dance, his grin thin and dangerous. For him, the land was not promise, but prey. The stranger did not see that fire, but he felt it in the wind, the way the night seemed restless. His horse shifted uneasily, ears twitching. He spoke softly to calm it, though his own chest carried the same unease. He had not come here for battles, not to fight another man's war. He had come to move forward, to find silence. But the prairie was not silent. It carried echoes of hoofbeats, gunfire, and cries that never fully faded. Out here, a man could not outrun his past, only ride deeper into it. He set his jaw, fixing his eyes on the horizon, where the last light smoldered red against the dark. The boy's question hung in the air even as he rode away. Was the land safe? The rider knew the truth. The frontier did not give safety. It gave only choices, and the cost of those choices was always blood. The night swallowed him, leaving only the town's faint glow behind. Somewhere out in the dark, a hawk circled, wings stretched wide, hunting in silence. The morning broke in silence, the kind that stretched across the plains like a held breath. The rider worked the widow's fences, hammering stakes into soil that resisted as stubbornly as she did. Sweat darkened his shirt, each strike of the mallet steady, deliberate. The boy followed close, carrying nails and a small tin, eager to be useful. He watched the rider with wide eyes, as though memorizing every movement, every calm command of the horse tethered nearby. The widow from the porch studied the stranger as she would a storm, untrusting, but aware he could bring more than destruction if handled wisely. When the rider paused, the boy asked questions about horses, about war, about the scar running down his left hand. The man's answers were short, careful, like words cost him something to spend. The widow interrupted when curiosity pressed too far. "He's here to work," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through silence. Yet when she carried a pitcher of water out to him, her hand lingered at the rim, offering not only drink but an unspoken acknowledgement. She needed him here, whether she wished it or not. The days fell into rhythm. Fences mended, animals tended, nights shared around a fire whose smoke curled into the stars. The boy told stories of his father. Bits of memory clung to like treasure, a strong laugh, a warm hand, the last ride he never returned from. The rider listened without interruption, though in a flicker of flame, his eyes betrayed a heaviness that made the widow look away. He never spoke of his own dead, but sometimes, when the boy slept, he would stare into the coals until dawn touched the horizon, lips moving in words no one else heard. Trouble, however, did not rest. Riders passed along the northern trail, carrying news. Outlaws had struck a wagon train, leaving blackened frames and bodies cooling in the dirt. Survivors spoke of a leader whose voice was smooth as whiskey and twice as dangerous. He preached freedom from law, from order, from ties to land or people. Men followed him because he promised more than coin. He promised power. The sheriff rode out to meet the survivors, returned with jaw set tight and his badge polished brighter than usual, as if to remind himself of the weight it carried. At the saloon, he called for volunteers. Few stepped forward. Fear was a leash, and the outlaw's reputation pulled it tight. The sheriff found himself standing alone, his words falling heavy against walls stained with spilled liquor. He caught sight of the rider at the back, leaning in shadow, silent. For a moment their eyes met. The sheriff saw in him the steady hand of a man who could tip the balance. But when he spoke of duty and protection, the rider shook his head, slow and firm. "I ain't law," he said. "I just work fences." The refusal was not cruel, only final, the voice of someone who had once carried that burden and vowed never again. The widow heard of it, and her anger burned hotter than her fear. She cornered the rider near the barn, hay clinging to her dress, eyes sharp. "You think work here ends at hammering posts?" she asked. "If men like him take the land, there'd be no fences left to mend." Her voice cracked at the edge, revealing the truth beneath her steel. She had buried one protector already, and the thought of burying another, stranger or not, gnawed at her. The rider said nothing, but her words stayed with him, echoing in the restless hours before dawn. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon in both sky and spirit. The gang struck again, this time closer. 2 ranches burned, cattle scattered into wild hills, children left orphaned. Ash drifted across the plains like falling snow. The town's fear hardened into anger, but anger without leadership was just smoke, rising and fading. The sheriff walked the streets with his hand near his gun, but even he knew his shadow grew smaller against the gathering storm. It was then the widow told the rider her story in full. Her husband had stood against raiders once, years ago, and for his defiance he was cut down before her eyes, their house set aflame. She had rebuilt alone, brick by brick, field by field, carrying grief like a stone in her chest. "I don't fear dying," she said, voice steady, "but I won't let them take what's his." "What's ours?" Her boy clung to her side, too young to understand the weight of such words, yet already learning them by heart. The rider listened, but his reply came only in the work of his hands. He built her barn doors stronger, lined her fences deeper, sharpened tools that might serve as weapons if needed. His silence was not absence, it was promise, though one he refused to speak aloud. Still, when the boy looked at him now, it was not with curiosity, but with trust. One evening, thunder rolled across the plains, carrying with the sound of hooves that were not from ranch stock. The rider was in the field when he heard it. He lifted his head, eyes narrowing. Far off, black shapes moved against the last light of day. Too many riders, too loose in their formation to be farmers, too bold to hide their approach. He watched them crest a ridge, then vanish back into the hills, the dust they raised clinging to the air long after. That night in the saloon, the sheriff confronted the townsfolk again. He slammed his hand against the table, eyes blazing. "Every fence, every home, every child depends on us standing together," he said. But his words met silence. Fear sat in the room heavier than smoke. When no one moved, the sheriff staggered back, as though the weight of their cowardice was more wound than any bullet. It was then the rider stepped forward, not to pledge himself, not yet, but to speak. "You wait for someone else to fight your battles. There won't be anyone left when the fire comes." His voice cut through the silence, low and steady. Men turned to listen, though he said no more. He left the saloon, his boots striking mud with finality. Alone at his campfire that night, the flames lit his face in broken flashes. He stared into them as though searching for answers he'd lost years before. His hand tightened around the tin cup, knuckles scarred, trembling only when memory rose too strong. In the crackle of burning wood, he heard the echo of gunfire, screams from fields long behind him, blood turning soil black. He closed his eyes, whispered words swallowed by the wind. Blood always finds its way back. A storm broke overhead, rain hissing as it struck fire. The rider pulled his coat tight, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The widow's words, the sheriff's plea, the boy's eyes, all circling him like hawks in the dark. He knew, despite his resistance, that the horizon was closing in. One could mend fences only so long before fire burned them all down. When the rain cleared, dawn crept pale and gray. The rider stood, shouldered his rifle, and looked toward the town still sleeping beneath the weight of its fear. The horizon glowed faint with promise, but he knew it was promise carved from blood. He set his jaw, mounted his horse, and rode out, not away, but toward what waited. The storm had only begun. The plain seemed darker now, even under sunlight, as though the land itself felt the gathering storm. Riders carried word of the outlaw gangs swelling in number, men drifting in from broken towns and failed farms, drawn by promises of spoils. Their camp spread like wildfire across the hills, torches flaring against the night. In the saloon, whispers spoke of a reckoning, of the gang's leader preparing to strike, not at lone wagons, but at the town itself. The sheriff rode from farm to farm, voice raw from urging men to take up rifles. but he returned each evening with fewer promises and more silence. Fear hollowed out the town until even its bravest kept their doors locked at dusk. Yet he did not stop. His badge had become less a symbol of law than a shield against despair, and he carried it with a stubbornness that bordered on madness. The rider stayed on the widow's land, his presence steady as stone, though every day he felt the weight of choice pressing harder. He rose early, tended to chores, taught the boy how to hold reins firm and aim a rifle true. He spoke little, but when he did, the boy listened as though each word were a secret worth keeping. The widow saw in him a man still running from ghosts, but also one who carried strength the land itself seemed to answer to. She did not ask again for promises, but her eyes lingered longer, searching for what he would not say. One afternoon, smoke rose on the horizon. The sheriff and a handful of men rode hard, returning with ash smeared across their faces. Another ranch gone, its barns reduced to cinders, livestock scattered. Survivors were few. The widow stood among the crowd as they spoke, her boy clutching her hand. The rider's jaw tightened, though he said nothing. That night, he found himself by the sheriff's side outside the saloon. The older man leaned against a post, lantern light, catching the creases in his weathered face. "I seen men like you," the sheriff said, voice low, "men who can carry more weight than others. But a time comes when carrying it alone breaks a man. Don't wait till it's too late." The rider answered with silence, eyes fixed on the dust stirring in the street. The sheriff sighed, as though he had expected no less, then walked back into the saloon, leaving the rider in the dark. Days later, betrayal struck. A townsman, worn thin by fear, whispered to the outlaws about supply wagons scheduled to arrive with ammunition and grain. The attack came swift, merciless. The wagons burned, their guards shot down before they could draw. Word reached the town in broken pieces, carried by a lone rider whose horse stumbled and collapsed at the gate. Panic spread like fever. Some spoke of fleeing, abandoning the settlement to the gang's fire. Others clung to the sheriff, begging for protection he no longer had to give. The widow stood at her doorway that night, rifle across her arms, boys sleeping inside. The rider lingered nearby, sharpening a blade in silence. "They'll come here sooner or later," she said. He met her eyes, the firelight between them painting both faces in copper and shadow. He nodded once. For the first time, she saw no hesitation in him. The raid came sooner than either expected. Hoofbeats thundered at dusk, and torches lit the ridge above her homestead. The boy ran to the door, eyes wide. The widow pushed him back, her voice firm despite the fear she could not hide. The rider stepped into the yard, rifle steady in his hands, shadow long across the dirt. The outlaws descended, shouting, firing into the air to scatter courage. The rider's first shot cracked sharp and final, dropping a horseman into the dust. Chaos followed. Fire spread to the barn, sparks snapping against the night sky. The widow fired from the porch, her shot clean, her stance unshaken. The boy hid in the shadows, clutching a knife too large for his hand. The rider moved with grim precision, each bullet placed with cold intent. But there were too many. Steel clashed, fists struck, the air thick with smoke and screams. In the frenzy, one outlaw broke past and charged toward the house. The rider's heart jolted. He turned, too far to intercept. The widow raised her rifle, but the man was on her before she could reload. Then, from the shadows, the boy thrust his blade upward. The outlaw staggered, stunned, before the rider's shot ended him. The boy stood trembling, blade dripping, his eyes wide with something he could never unsee. The remaining raiders broke and fled, dragging their wounded, leaving smoke and blood in their wake. The barn burned to embers. The field churned to mud. The rider stood in the ruin, chest heaving, sweat and ash streaking his face. The widow gathered her boy, holding him tight, despite the knife still clutched in his shaking hand. For a moment, the three of them stood together in silence, the weight of survival heavier than the fight itself. When dawn came, the rider sat alone on the porch steps, rifle across his knees. The boy slept inside, exhaustion finally claiming him. The widow stood in the doorway, eyes fixed on the stranger who had become their shield. "You can't keep running," she said softly. "Not from them, not from yourself. He did not look at her, but the truth of her words pressed against him harder than any bullet. Later that morning, townsfolk arrived, drawn by the smoke. They saw the dead laid out in the dirt, the barn reduced to blackened ribs. The sheriff knelt by the bodies, his face carved in sorrow but also in resolve. He rose, placed a hand on the rider's shoulder. "They'll come again, and worse. This town won't stand without you." The rider looked past him, to the widow holding her boy, to the faces of men who had once stayed silent in the saloon. He saw in them not courage yet, but a flicker of something close. He knew then that choice was no longer his. The fight had already claimed him. That evening, the boy asked the question he had once whispered to his mother: "Will it ever be safe?" His small voice cut deeper than any wound. The rider crouched, met the boy's eyes, and found no answer. He stood, turned his gaze to the horizon, where storm clouds gathered thick and heavy, lightning stitching the sky in ragged seams. His silence said more than words could. The boy understood, even if he wished not to. The widow watched him from the doorway, lips pressed tight, knowing he had crossed some line within himself. The sheriff stood nearby, hand on his gun, ready for the inevitable. Beyond them, the horizon waited, red with stormlight, alive with the promise of blood. Dawn broke in silence, but the silence was heavy, expectant. The town had spent the night preparing, hammering shutters into place, stacking barrels for barricades, sharpening knives that had once been used only for cutting rope or carving meat. Men who had never held a gun with intent now gripped rifles, as though they were lifelines. Women carried water, gathered children, and hid prayers in the folds of their skirts. The air itself trembled, thick with fear and resolve. The sheriff stood at the heart of the main street, his badge catching what little light bled through storm clouds. His face was pale with fatigue, but unyielding, a man determined to stand even if the ground beneath him gave way. Beside him, the rider checked his revolver, each motion slow, practiced, final. The widow watched from the church steps, her boy pressed close at her side, eyes wide with a mix of dread and admiration. For the first time, the rider wore the look of someone not passing through but rooted, as though the dust itself had claimed him. Hoofbeats arrived with the sunrise, a low thunder rolling from the hills. Then came the figures, dozens, perhaps more, riding fast, torches flaring against the gray sky. The outlaw leader rode at the front, his smile cruel, his hand resting lazily on the butt of his pistol, as though this fight was nothing but theater. He slowed as they neared, surveying the town with mockery in his eyes. His voice carried over the wind, smooth and cutting. "Step aside, old man," he called to the sheriff. "You can't hold back the tide." The sheriff's reply was steady, low but clear. "Maybe not, but tides still break against rock." He lifted his rifle. The rider did the same. A single shot cracked, sharp and final, the signal that tore silence apart. The battle that followed was chaos carved into the earth. Gunfire thundered through the street, windows shattered, dust and smoke mixing into a storm of sound. Townsfolk fired from rooftops, from behind barrels, from doorways they had sworn to defend. The outlaws surged forward like floodwater, ruthless, relentless. Horses screamed as they fell, men tumbled into mud, blood soaking into the same soil they had fought to claim. The sheriff fired until his rifle clicked empty, then drew his revolver and kept shooting, each shot slower, weaker. A bullet struck him in the side, staggering him, but he stayed standing, reloading with trembling hands. He caught the rider's gaze across the smoke and gave a faint nod, a final acknowledgement that the burden was passing whether either man willed it or not. Another shot hit him, and this time he dropped to his knees, blood spreading across his shirt like ink and water. Still, he lifted his revolver one last time, firing into the chaos until his hand fell limp. The rider fought with cold precision, his revolver steady, each shot deliberate, never wasted. He moved through the street like a shadow, slipping between bursts of gunfire, his face grim, his body driven by something deeper than survival. He saw the outlaw leader cutting through the fray, twin pistols blazing, his laughter carrying above the screams. Their eyes locked. Two men bound not by law or crime, but by inevitability. The duel began not with words, but with silence between gunfire. They faced each other in the dust, smoke curling around them, the world narrowing to the weight of their hands and the steadiness of their eyes. The outlaw leader moved quick, smooth as a snake, but the rider's draw was clean, honed by years of violence he had tried to leave behind. The first shot struck both men, one in the shoulder, the other in the side. Pain twisted their bodies, but neither fell. They circled, mud sucking at their boots, revolvers raised again. The widow watched in the church steps, her heart pounding against her ribs, the boy clutching her arm, his voice caught in his throat. The townsfolk held their breath, their rifles momentarily still. For an instant, all of the frontier seemed to hinge on the space between two men. The outlaw leader smirked, blood dripping from his lip. "You'll die same as the rest," he spat. The rider said nothing, only tightened his grip. When their gun spoke again, the sound was thunder, the echo rolling across the plains. The outlaw leader staggered back, eyes wide, his pistol falling from his hand. He dropped into the dust, the smile finally gone from his face. The rider stood swaying, his own blood dark against his shirt, his breath ragged. He lowered his revolver slowly, the weight of it pulling down as though it carried every ghost he had tried to outrun. Around him, the battle broke. The outlaws, seeing their leader fall, scattered into the hills, leaving behind their dead and their wounded. The townsfolk stepped out, blinking through smoke, disbelief on their faces that they still stood. The sheriff lay near the saloon, his breathing shallow. The rider knelt beside him, pressing a hand against the wound, though both knew it was useless. The sheriff's eyes found his, clouded but fierce. "Town's yours now," he rasped. "Don't let it fall." His hand slipped, the badge tumbling into the mud. The rider picked it up, holding it for a long moment before closing the sheriff's eyes. Silence settled after, broken only by the sobs of the widow as she gathered her boy into her arms. The townsfolk moved like sleepwalkers, tending to the wounded, dragging bodies from the street, whispering prayers over fallen. The rider stood apart, watching with an expression that was neither victory nor relief. It was survival, and survival always came at a cost. When the sun dipped low, turning the sky red as blood, the widow approached. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, but her gaze was steady. "Stay," she said, a single word heavy with plea and promise. The boy clung to her skirt, looking at the rider with eyes that begged the same. For a moment, he wavered. For a moment, the image of roots, of belonging, burned bright enough to tempt him. But he shook his head, voice low. "This land needs roots, not ghosts. And I'm a ghost." The widow's lips parted as though to argue, but she said nothing. She only nodded, understanding even as her heart broke. The rider saddled his horse in silence, the badge of the fallen sheriff still heavy in his pocket. He did not pin it to his chest. He left it on the church steps, where the boy might one day see it and remember. Then he mounted, turning his horse toward the horizon. The townsfolk watched him go, the widow holding her son tight, the church bell tolling slow, mourning and resolute. The rider's silhouette stretched long against the blazing sunset, each step carrying him further from the town he had saved but could never claim. The horizon swallowed him as it always had, vast and merciless. Wind stirred the dust, carrying whispers of his passing. The boy asked quietly if he would return, but the widow only held him closer, her eyes fixed on a place where the sun met the earth. The land was quiet again, but it was a quiet bought with blood, one that would not last forever. Yet for now, there was hope, a fragile flame flickering in the ruins. The rider disappeared into the blaze of the setting sun, a lone shadow against the endless sky. The final truth lingered in the dust he left behind. The frontier did not remember names, only blood, wind, and the horizon.